We're going to go ahead and proceed according to schedule, but in a little bit of advanced fashion. If you weren't here this morning, I'd like to re-announce that Dr. Miriam Hennick will not be with us today or tomorrow or the duration of the conference. Her mom passed away a couple days ago, and she had to fly out to be with her and her family. But Dr. Hennick has a tremendous amount of confidence in the panel that she has established, as well as I do, and we're just delighted to have these individuals here to help us deal with a very important issue, hearing loss associated with listening and performing music. So I'd like to turn it over to Marshall Chasin.
Thank you, Chris. He is kind of cute, isn't he? He does blush very easily. As the intro, the overview of the problem, I would like to thank Miriam Hennick for chairing this committee and getting us all together on the same page and getting us down here. I'm the sole Canadian here, so if I talk kind of funny, that's the excuse. My name is Marshall Chasin. I'm an audiologist from Canada. I run the Musicians Clinics of Canada. Let me just figure out how this thing works. There we go. There we go. This one? This one there? Okay. As you can see, I may be an audiologist, but I'm not very technically inclined. Health promotion in schools and music project. This is for the Hearing Health Group. By and large, hearing loss is also called the invisible handicap, and it's very similar to the talk this morning on vocal abuse and vocal problems, because that's also an invisible handicap. It's something that gradually sneaks up on you over many, many years. We'll see that shortly. The statement of the problem: music may not be noise, but it can be hazardous to the ears. In other words, Beethoven, Mozart can be very, very damaging to the ears. And again, as we'll see, it's not so much that the intensity of Beethoven or Mozart is like the, Guess Who, or the Who, the Stones, or the Beatles, or any of the other big rock and roll groups, but many symphony orchestras, whether it's classical or otherwise, they tend to play 4, 5, 6 times a week. They may practice for 4 or 5 hours a day. They may teach 4 or 5 hours a day. So the total number of hours of exposure through a day can be quite a bit. This is from Miriam and Chris's work from a couple years ago, performed in Medical Problems of Performing Artists, which is the journal of the Performing Artists Medical Association, PAMA. By the way, for those that haven't ever attended a Performing Artists Medical Association meeting in Aspen in July, you might want to go. I've only been there twice, but it's fascinating. They have all the talks in an old converted opera house, and then you get to rollerblade down to the dance festival or the music festival when the talks get a little bit boring. But by and large, it's a really good conference. In a self-report scale, they found that of rock and roll musicians, 32% of them thought they had a hearing loss. Actually, the true value is a little bit higher. People tend to underreport things. Jazz blues, 28%. Of the music educators, about a quarter of them, 24%, felt they had a hearing loss. Classical opera singers and musicians felt that it was around 20%. Actually, it's much higher than rock and roll, believe it or not. Folk and country down around 19%, and church and gospel only 17%, almost 1 in 6, a little bit more than 1 in 6 felt they had a hearing loss. The true story, though, as we'll see, is a little bit higher. This is a picture of our inner ear, and Dr. Tufts, who will be speaking next, will be going over some of the anatomy in more detail, but this is our inner ear, and of course the outer ear is what we see, that we hang our glasses on. Usually that's quite intact and healthy with music or noise-induced hearing loss. The eardrum is healthy. The middle ear, where kids get ear infections, that's healthy as well. It's the inner ear, which is the size of my small fingernail, is usually the damaged element. By the way, for those that are not Canadian, this is metric for this. It's a Canadian thing. Anyway, that's a joke. Anyways, the cochlea, or the inner ear, has 13 to 15,000 nerve endings, and it's arrayed like a piano keyboard. On one hand, on the right-hand side, those are the higher pitched notes, and as you get more coiled in the 2.5 turns of the human inner ear, you get into the more bass notes. Now, even though we can hear from a low frequency about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, which is far, far above anything we'd normally need to hear, we're only interested in the hearing field between about middle C, about the middle of the piano keyboard, and an octave or so above the top note of the piano keyboard. So as audiologists, we're only restricted or concerned with a very restricted range from the middle to the right-hand side of the piano keyboard. This is an intact-looking inner ear or intact-looking cochlea. This is one where a lot of the higher frequency nerve endings have been damaged, or in this case, carried away. And this person would have a very significant high frequency permanent hearing loss. The nerve endings in the inside of the coil, they're still intact. And usually these people have very, very good hearing there. And that leads us to a very interesting predicament. This is called an audiogram, for those who have never seen one. Along the north-south axis, the y-axis, we have hearing loss in decibels. And along the east-west x-axis, we have frequency. Think of it like the piano keyboard. The most left side of the chart is an octave above middle C, and then the most right side is an octave above the top end of the piano keyboard. So we're just testing a very limited range of the piano keyboard. At the very top, we have exposure less than 1 year, and you can see essentially normal hearing. Normal hearing would actually be a straight line right across. But as the years progress, 5 to 9 years, you see this little notch forming around 4,000 hertz, which is at the outermost part of the inner ear where there's a lot of damage, and then 15 to 19 years, it gets worse, and 40 to 50 years of exposure, it's down quite a bit. But the interesting thing about this curve is that in the very low frequencies around middle C, a person with a very, very significant hearing loss retains excellent hearing. And so that's where the vowels are. So they might say, oh, I hear you okay. You're just mumbling. It's your problem. It's not my problem. They can still hear the musical instrument. They can still hear the fundamental energy, but they can't hear the harmonic energy quite as well. So that's the first element, that it's usually just in certain frequency regions that people have a hearing loss. And the second component of this is that it's a very, very gradual, slow progression. People don't notice it from day to day. They notice it after 20 or 30 or 40 years. Now, from a hearing loss prevention point of view, I don't really care that much about this. I do, of course, but this is secondary. Working with musicians, what we care about more is the prevention of things that can be career-threatening, such as constant ringing or tinnitus in the ears, which we'll be talking about shortly, and also pitch perception problems, where you play a C, but it sounds like B flat. Both of these can not only ruin your enjoyment of the music, but end your career. So that's what I'm primarily concerned about. Specific problems as they currently exist in the school system. There's no formal education relative to the risks and prevention of hearing loss in college music students. No mandatory monitoring of hearing status. No mandatory measurement of sound level. No regulations of permissible sound levels in performance and practice facilities. All these result in obviously a very major problem. I'm going to turn the docket over now to Dr. Tufts. We'll talk about whatever she's going to talk about. Here, I'll just... There you go. No, it's mine. I won't give it away.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay. I'm Jennifer Tufts. I'm a researcher and an audiologist at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And I'm speaking to you today as a former college music student. I was a music major, an undergrad music major at Holy Cross College in Massachusetts. In fact, that's where I had my freshman recital. And I loved it. It was such a positive experience. So I'm very honored to be able to address you today in the hopes of making a difference for future music students. I'm going to be presenting some information to you, some basic information on how the auditory system works, and also on the effects of overexposure to sound. And I use the word sound because I want to emphasize that it's not just noise from chainsaws or power tools that can cause hearing loss, but any type of sound, even music. And as I was preparing this talk, I realized that we don't often have the occasion to think about our hearing unless, of course, something goes wrong. So I thought I'd begin by sharing with you some of the amazing capabilities of the ear. The human ear is truly a remarkable instrument. At its most basic level, our ears are like early warning systems because we can usually hear danger before we can see it. Our ears are always on even when we're fast asleep. And you know that if you've ever been awakened in the middle of the night because you heard a sound even though you were asleep. We can hear sounds from all directions, even from behind us. It's almost like having eyes in the back of our heads. We can hear sounds around and even through obstacles, something that our eyes just can't do. Okay, our ears are very sensitive to soft sounds. At the threshold of hearing, the eardrum moves a distance smaller than the diameter of a hydrogen atom. And that infinitesimal motion translates into a hearing sensation. In fact, if our hearing was just a bit more sensitive, we would actually be able to hear air molecules randomly colliding. Simply amazing. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, sounds at the threshold of pain produce 1 million times more pressure at the eardrum than a barely audible sound. So the dynamic range of the ear is simply remarkable. But the decibel scale covers this range in about 120 steps. So it's a lot more manageable to think in terms of decibels than in terms of sound pressures. I'm going to skip this chart here. Okay, we can hear differences in pitch on the order of 1/30th of a semitone at our most sensitive. And we can hear sounds over a range of almost 10 octaves. Of course, not all of that range is musically useful. Starting from a little bit above the range of the piano keyboard, sounds don't produce usable musical pitch sensations. But still, it's an incredible range of hearing. It's interesting to compare human hearing to the hearing of animals. Now, human hearing ranges from 20 hertz, as Marshall said, looking for the 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And by way of reference, the piano keyboard goes from about, I think it's 27 hertz out to about 4,000 hertz, and that'd be right around here. Now, if we look at the hearing of the dog, let me go backwards. The dog's hearing extends to a higher frequency range than humans, which is why they can hear dog whistles and we can't. And while I'm on this chart, just one more interesting thing that I noticed here. The elephant and the moth live in completely different auditory worlds. Everything that the elephant can hear, the moth is deaf to, and vice versa. Now, of course, the bat and the moth, they live in the same world, predator-prey, and they're living in the same auditory world. But that gives you an idea of the range of human hearing compared to animals. Now, even though we can hear over a very wide range of frequencies, our ears are most sensitive in the range of speech frequencies. And the important speech frequencies run from about 500 to 4,000 hertz, and that's in the middle of that range. And that brings us to perhaps the most important function of our ears, which is to connect us to other people through speech and also through music. Okay, so now I'm going to give you an overview of how our ears actually accomplish all these amazing things. This is a picture showing you the peripheral auditory system. And when I say the peripheral auditory system, I mean everything from the pinna, or the ear on the outside of your head, to the auditory nerve that sends signals to the brain. And the central auditory system, which we're not going to be talking about, that includes all the parts of the brain that process auditory signals. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to focus on the peripheral system. Sound waves enter the ear canal, which on average is a little over an inch long, and they reach the eardrum. Now, as you probably are aware, sound waves are just patterned vibrations of air molecules. So the eardrum literally behaves like a drum and picks up these vibrations. Here's a picture of an eardrum here. This is a healthy eardrum. The eardrum is a very thin membrane. It's actually partially transparent, but it's very strong and it's very sensitive to vibrations. This structure that you see here, this is a small bone embedded in the eardrum. It's called the malleus. So if we go back to this view here, there's the malleus right there. It's the first one in a chain of 3 very tiny bones. And these 3 bones and the space they're in, that's what's known as the middle ear. So the vibrations of the tympanic membrane, or I should say the eardrum, another name for the eardrum is the tympanic membrane, so you'll hear me slip up. The name reinforces its behavior as a drum, the tympanic membrane. But those vibrations, they get transmitted through this chain of bones to the tiny bone at the end there called the stapes. And the stapes will vibrate back and forth. Just to give you an idea of the dimensions we're looking at, there's an actual human stapes on a Lincoln penny there. It's the smallest bone in the human body, sometimes called the stirrup, obviously because of its shape. So now we have the stapes vibrating back and forth, and those vibrations are transmitted to the cochlea. This is the inner ear. This is the part that we're mostly concerned about. The cochlea, it's a tiny chamber that's encased in the temporal bone of the skull, and it's spiral-shaped and filled with fluid. So the vibrations of the stapes now gets transmitted to that fluid inside the cochlea. This is a cutaway version of the cochlea. And just to orient you, we've got the eardrum up here, and then the stapes over here. These canals up here, these are also part of the inner ear, but they have to do with balance, not hearing, so we're not going to talk about them. Now down here we see the cochlea has been cut away so you can see inside. If we take a little chunk of that little blue square, and we blow it up, we get this view here. There's 3 chambers in there, and each one's filled with fluid. And we're going to focus on the middle chamber here because that's where the action is. The membrane that separates that middle chamber from the lower one is called the basilar membrane. When the cochlear fluid is disturbed, the basilar membrane vibrates in a very characteristic way. This view here is showing you the cochlea unrolled. And I stuck that little party favor up in the corner there just to remind you that the cochlea is actually rolled up. But we've unrolled it here, so you can see that the basilar membrane runs almost the entire length of the cochlea. So you can see the stapes moving back and forth, and it creates a wave on the basilar membrane. And the peak of that wave, this is what Marshall was talking about in terms of the cochlea being tuned like a keyboard. The location of the wave will change depending on the frequency of vibration. So sounds with a very high frequency will cause a peak to occur at the end near the stapes. And sounds with lower frequencies will cause a peak further out here in the end, what we call the apex. So our ears actually perform a frequency analysis of the sounds that come in. So if we go back here to this view for a second, this motion of the basilar membrane is crucial because sitting on top of the basilar membrane is a sensory organ of hearing. It's called the organ of Corti. So we're just going to blow that up and look at that briefly. Okay, this is the organ of Corti, and there's the basilar membrane. There's 2 types of cells in the organ of Corti, and you've probably heard of them, the outer hair cells and the inner hair cells. These are specialized cells. They do slightly different jobs. The inner hair cells are actually the sensory cells, but the outer hair cells have a very important function as well of amplifying and tuning the signal. At the bottoms of the hair cells are synapses with nerve fibers, and then at the tops are these bundles of very small hairs. Now what happens when the basilar membrane moves, these hairs move back and forth, and what that does is it initiates a neurochemical reaction in the inner hair cell. And bam, the nerve fibers, and then send signals off to the brain. Okay, once the signals reach the brain, then they undergo many levels of processing. Auditory areas of the brain are connected to areas that deal with language, memory, emotion, and so forth. And I would point out that it's at the level of the brain that we're first even aware of sound. And it's at this level, too, that we can direct our auditory attention. Say you're listening to a piece and you want to pick out the oboe part and you can follow it. That's a job of our brains directing our auditory attention. It's an amazing capability. So what happens if we overdrive the ear? I'm not going to talk about what sound levels and durations are hazardous because that's going to be covered later, but I do just want to point out some of the effects of overexposure to sound. This is a cochlea that was prepared post-mortem from an individual who'd worked many years in a noisy and industrial setting. And I want to draw your attention to this outer area here where you can see a loss of outer hair cells and a loss of the nerve fibers connecting them. And this section, this region here is tuned to about 3,000 to 6,000 hertz. If we were to give this person a hearing test, we'd probably find normal to near normal hearing in the low frequencies and a substantial hearing loss in the higher frequencies, particularly in this 3,000 to 6,000 hertz region. And this pattern of damage is very characteristic of damage due to noise exposure. Now here's a little closer view of some hair cells. These are healthy hair cells. You're actually sort of looking down on the top of them. So those little V's that you see, those are the hairs that move back and forth. Those are healthy cells. You can contrast them with these hair cells, damaged due to noise exposure, and some of the hairs are deformed and some of the bundles of hairs are missing altogether. This kind of damage to the outer hair cells will cause hearing loss. Noise-induced hearing loss happens gradually. It's not something that typically happens overnight. It happens over years. So it's very insidious. It sneaks up on you. Usually it occurs in both ears, although there are exceptions. For example, violinists, their left ears are closer to the noise source and therefore, oh, I shouldn't call it noise, the music source. And the sound source. Okay, so their left ears are more susceptible to damage. Oftentimes, noise-induced hearing loss is accompanied by tinnitus, and this is almost as troubling, if not more troubling, than the hearing loss itself. Tinnitus refers to any kind of sounds in the ears, like ringing, could be roaring, and it can be very troubling. Noise-induced hearing loss is painless. It's progressive. It continues to grow over time. It's permanent, so once it's gone, it's not coming back. But the good news is that it's also preventable. Now here's an example of a mild noise-induced hearing loss. This is an audiogram which you've just seen, and going from left to right, we go from low frequencies to high frequencies, and then from top to bottom here, we move from normal hearing through all the different degrees of hearing loss down to profound deafness at the bottom. So this individual has normal hearing through the low to mid frequencies here. But then you'll notice in the region from about 3,000 to 6,000 hertz, this individual has a mild hearing loss. And this should remind you of the picture that we just saw showing the damage in that region. This is what we call a noise notch, and it's very characteristic of damage due to overexposure to sound. Now this is a very mild case. It's not career-threatening or anything, but I think of this as a warning. Because over time, if the exposure continues, this notch can widen and it can deepen to include more frequencies. Just by way of reference, this is middle C on the piano. This is concert A. And that's the top note on the piano. But I would remind you that musical sounds have overtones, and those overtones will extend into much higher frequencies than are measured here, and those are important for timbre. Now usually noise-induced hearing loss, it's often preceded by many episodes of temporary hearing loss, or what we call temporary threshold shift. So if you've ever left a concert and your ears are ringing and everything sounds kind of muffled, you're experiencing temporary threshold shift. And what it is it's transient hair cell dysfunction. The hair cells get tired, they get fatigued, they wear out, and then in a couple days, they come back to normal. So this audiogram here is actually of a teenage girl who is experiencing temporary threshold shift. She was at a rock concert for many hours the night previous, and then was complaining about the typical symptoms of ringing in the ears, and she felt like there were cotton in her ears. So this was her hearing test, and a couple of days later, her hearing had returned to normal. But if she had gone the next night to a concert, and the next night, and the next night, and didn't allow her ears that time to recover, over time, eventually this noise notch would become permanent, and then it can get worse. So here's a little more advanced case of noise-induced hearing loss. This is a 55-year-old man, and what sent him to the doctor was not the hearing loss itself, but the debilitating tinnitus that he was experiencing. He's got normal to near normal hearing in the very lowest pitches, but then in the higher frequencies, notice that there's a lot more extensive region of damage here, out to about a moderately severe loss in the higher frequencies. So what I'd like to do is just play you a demo to show you what music might sound like to somebody with this kind of hearing loss. So first I'm going to play you an excerpt of music just as is. It's about 1 minute. Okay, now you'll hear that same excerpt, but altered to simulate what it might be like listening through a hearing aid with that kind of hearing loss. Okay, so this is a situation that as a musician you want to avoid. The radio's clearly on, but the station is just not tuned in. Exposure to hazardous levels of sound are not going to deafen somebody, but noise-induced hearing loss can be very handicapping, especially to a musician. First of all, it is the inability to hear soft to moderate sounds, and that's particularly in the higher frequencies. The low-frequency hearing is usually preserved pretty well. Then a reduced dynamic range, so the difference between sounds that are barely audible and barely tolerable, especially in the high frequencies, that range can get pretty small. And tinnitus, as you said, it can be very troubling. Just as your outer world is becoming a little more muffled, your inner world is getting noisier and noisier. Distortion, as you just heard, even when the sounds are loud enough to be able to hear, a lot of times the quality is very poor. And distortion can take many forms. Pitch distortion, for example, you might have difficulty matching octaves, judging musical interval sizes. We recently ran a study showing that people with hearing loss rated the perfect fourth and the tritone to be equally dissonant, just about. So even if sounds are loud enough, the quality can be very poor. Difficulty understanding speech, particularly again, the low-frequency hearing is preserved, so you're able to hear speech, but the high-pitched consonant sounds are what's missing oftentimes, especially in a noisy environment or a reverberant environment. And then a reduced ability to hear and appreciate music. And all of these effects are due to loss and or damage of the hair cells. And we can't overlook the impact of living with a hearing loss on a person's happiness, their sense of well-being, their social life. I'd like to read to you a paragraph written by a person describing his experience with a progressive hearing loss. My misfortune is doubly painful to me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. I must live almost alone. Forgive me when you see me draw back when I would gladly have mingled with you. These words were written by Beethoven when he was 32. So today, we're a little better off. Hearing aids and other assistive listening devices, cochlear implants and so forth, they can make life a lot better for even people with profound deafness. But as you heard in the demo, that there's really no substitute for healthy hearing. So Beethoven's words remind us that healthy hearing really is a treasure, and I hope you'll take that message with you today. Thank you. I can take any questions now or any questions at the end.
Well, it's good to see you answered all the questions.
That's right. Okay.
There's got to be it. Here it comes.
You
I
need
got
an
it.
audiologist help.
No. I am an audiologist. I used to be a speech pathologist, and now I understand electronics. I couldn't find the. I'm left-handed though, and I couldn't make the mouse work. I have to use a trackball at home, or I go crazy. I'm Laura Wilbur. I'm a professor emeritus at Northwestern University, which means that I'm old. Now, this could be the reaction to somebody that heard too much sound and was annoyed by the noise. It also could be the reaction of somebody hearing me play the violin. I'm not quite sure which. My father was a history teacher at one point, and so I have to tell you some of the history, no matter whether you care or not. There will be an exam on the dates later. Now, to begin with, because I'm talking about the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the kinds of rules and regulations that they have, we need to know a little bit about why we have rules and regulations in the first place. We know that there have been laws regulating sound and noise as far back as the Romans, but I don't think they had anything to do with occupation. I think they had to do only with annoyance. The most recent ones that we're really positive about in this country was in 1936, the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act. And essentially, all it really covers are those companies that had contracts with the government. So if you didn't work for the government, you didn't have to obey any of the rules or suggested regulations. And also, the initial rules and regulations really dealt with injury on the job that prevented you from continuing to do your work. So if you were hurt on the job and you couldn't continue to do that job, you should be reimbursed. And that was the initial thought. In '49, after the Second World War, for those of you who are too young to remember when that occurred, the Air Force standard was developed, and that was partly because they found out a lot of guys came back from the Second World War with hearing losses, and pilots who need to communicate in the airplane were having extreme difficulty. So the Air Force published an initial standard. In 1968, the Department of Labor finally got around to publishing a standard relative to the level at which people should be exposed to noise. And they first were suggesting 85 dBA. In a minute, I'll tell you what that really kind of means, for a time-weighted average of 8 hours. In 1969, the Walsh-Healy Noise Standard Act became law, and by this time, the feds had backed off a little bit and changed their thinking. They no longer thought, in the case of noise specifically, that the damage that you incurred on the job had to prevent you from doing the job, only that job created the hearing loss that you had. Big distinction. With you all, with musicians, clearly if you had a hearing loss, that could impact on the way you did the job. But for most industrial workers, having a hearing loss because of noise on the job didn't have a thing to do with how well they could do their job. But the feds got the concept, and it has been pervasive since then, that no, this has changed your quality of life, it's changed your health because of the damage that occurred to you at the workplace. Therefore, your employer should be responsible for reimbursing you for part of this problem, even though it didn't keep you from having a job. It seems to me that it's sort of interesting because for musicians and for theater people and for news broadcasters and people that interview people for news, you need your ears. And yet these industries are not covered. We'll talk again a little bit more about that a little bit later. In '69, the Coal Health Mine Safety Act was passed, and that also protected against hearing, although you can certainly dig a coal mine with profound hearing loss. But if you've ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, or if you have been to Pennsylvania and been in the coal mines or West Virginia, that machinery is very loud, very loud. And you're likely to incur a hearing loss if you're down underground for very long. I almost got one in the Museum of Science and Industry. In 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Act was established, and that created the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Notice, this is 1970 before we really began to get totally serious. And those of you who have as many gray hairs as I may recall what else was going on in terms of movements about that time. Not just the Civil Rights Act, but there was another movement that occurred starting in the late 60s. And that was dealing with the environment, remember? Remember all the issues trying to have good, clean environment for all of us. And that, I think, also contributed to some of the kinds of laws and regulations that were being passed on the federal level. NIOSH published and recommended a standard that said 85 dBA, that you should not be exposed to an average of 85 dBA, to more than an average of 85 dBA. Sounded pretty good for an 8-hour day. That assumes 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 20 years. Okay, so if you work for 5 years, I guess you're okay, but if you were going to work for 20 years, by the end of that time, you would be expected to have some hearing loss. And 82, EPA, there were some political changes going on, and EPA ceased funding of the Office of Noise Abatement and Control, and that had regulated some of these standards, controlled them. In 83, OSHA amended its act, and by 83, OSHA is now saying 90 dBA. That sound has to reach 90 dBA before it becomes damaging to your ears. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about the fact that they also said that if sound reaches 85, you've got to have a hearing conservation program. So even though noise isn't going to damage your ears, no. Yeah, right. It is necessary to have a hearing conservation program. Does that sound a little suspicious to you? It always did to me. I wouldn't suspect anybody of any political things at all in that. No, not at all. All right, there was another standard by the Mine Safety, and they proposed having hearing conservation regulations. And 98 NIOSH, who remember is initially under the same agency as OSHA, said, look guys, 85 is where it should be, and they published a criteria for recommended standard occupational noise exposures of 85 dBA for time-weighted average of 8. And it utilized a 3 dB doubling rate. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but there are doubling rules that say if you are at 85 dBA for 8 hours, that's okay. If you're at 90 dB for, in this case, 88 dB for 4 hours, that's okay. If you're at 91, it's hard for me to add 3 to these numbers. You can't be there for more than 2 hours, etc. Okay? That's kind of the concept, but we'll show you another example a little bit later. 99, the Mine Safety Act went into effect again, but it kept the same old rules. Well, first of all, I want to ask you, who's missing from the regulations? How many of you are miners? How many of you work in industry? You do a lot of that, right? Well, the people that are missing from any of these regulations are agriculture, service industries, entertainment industries. And none of these industries are we covered by regulations at this point in time. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't ever be. Railroad industry does have regulations, and they are similar to some of the ones that we've already talked about. But these industries aren't, partly because they don't have contracts with the government. It's a little bit more difficult to start regulations when you don't have contacts with the government, but in part because we don't have the kind of lobbying, even though some of these industries, certainly the entertainment industry, hearing loss would be a major concern or could be a major concern. What specifically are then these Walsh-Healy or OSHA requirements for noise exposure? Now what they're saying is if you obey these requirements, most people will not have a hearing loss. It is theoretically possible to protect everybody from having a hearing loss due to noise exposure. But if you did that, you would have to say that they could never be exposed to any noise that was much louder than conversational speech. And that's not going to happen. Okay, so they have to go somewhere above that in order to say reasonable. And the government has decided, well, anybody that deals with risk management says, okay, we cannot protect 100% of the people. It's too expensive. But we can protect a certain percentage of the people. So let's see what percentage we want to protect. Now, underlying that also is the concept, I don't know who's in that percentage. I don't know who's going to be protected and who's not. I don't know if you will have a hearing loss after you're exposed to 90 dBA for 8 hours a day for 20 years, or if you will, or if you both will. If I could ever develop the procedure that would say, absolutely, I can say if you were exposed to X dB for 8 hours, you're going to have a hearing loss after 20 years, I'd make a fortune. Every industry would want to hire me because they would never hire the people that I said were going to have a hearing loss. But they'd all want to hire me. But that hasn't been done, although people have worked on that concept for at least most of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, ever since industry. So the first thing that we have as a rule is a 90 dBA, that sound should not exceed 90 dBA. That's a maximum average of 8 hours for permissible noise exposure limit, the PEL, or permissible exposure limit. And that is then the level at which engineering or administrative controls must be initiated. Now, the law really says feasible. Don't you love that word, feasible? I just love it to death. As an audiologist or as an engineer, all my cousins are engineers, so I claim part there. They all said to me, all right, feasible means can we do it? The feds say, is it going to cost too much? It's not feasible if it's going to cost too much. Even if you can do it, you're not really held responsible if it's going to cost too much. So feasible then means that, okay, you don't have to really lower the noise levels to this, but you do have to have something going, either engineering controls, and if you can't do that, administrative controls, and that would mean that the worker can only work X number of hours here, has to work somewhere else for the rest of the time if the noise levels are too high. Or he has to wear hearing protector. Now, I stole this from Dr. Berger when he wasn't looking. And this is a chart reminding you what dB levels are, because I never remember. But essentially, a quiet whisper is around 20 dB. Rice Krispies are 30. I thought that was kind of fun. Did you do that experiment? I thought he did. Conversation is around 60 or 65 dB. Mid-sized automobile is around 65 dB, 70 dB. Vacuum cleaner is around 80 dB, so women are more likely to have hearing loss. A leaf blower is around 90 dB. It sounds a lot louder to me than that at 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. A basketball crowd noise, not at my stadium at Northwestern, it's down about 90 there. We did win a game once, I remember distinctly. But if you go to Duke, perhaps, or North Carolina or some other place, they can get up to 120 dB. That hurts. It almost hurts. That's very close to the level of a jet aircraft. Okay. Here's another example. Whispers of 2025, background music about 50. You don't like background music anyway. You don't want to know about that. Hair dryers around 80 to 95, a coffee dryer, and so forth. These are some typical sound levels. So you can see that 90 dBA is fairly loud. It's louder than I'm talking right now, okay? I can scream louder than that, but I don't think we'll do that. I don't have a sound level meter to be sure what it is after these particular loudspeakers. Here's some modal, this is a study that shows the modal level of some instruments, 88 dB for strings, 95 for horn and trumpet, they're already exceeding it. Clarinet percussion, 92, bass, cello, harp, 86. This is from a study by Royster, and Killian. There have been other studies that have shown other levels, but consistently the levels tend to exceed the 85 dBA that we have said is probably reasonably safe. Now, I said, why do we have 90 rather than 85 in the government standards? And I'm not going to say this is a reason, but by coincidence, I noticed when I looked at the data that you would have to cover some 12% more of the workers in the food industry. You'd have to, well, almost 25% routinely would have to be covered if you went to 85 rather than to 90? Is it science? Is it politics? Probably. Now, part of that is simply because the government believes if you put too many restrictions and have too much cost to the company's going to go out of business, and then workers are not going to be employed, et cetera, et cetera. I am not an economist. I can't argue either way on that particular question. The exchange rate, which OSHA recommends, is 5 dB. That is to have the exposure. If you are exposed to 95 dB as opposed to 90, instead of working 8 hours, you can only work 4 hours, et cetera. Now, is this consistent across the country? No. Here are some examples. The OSHA requirements, the Air Force Navy requirements, the Army requirements. Now, why the Air Force and Navy are different than the Army, I don't know. We won't get into that. And ISO and NIOSH are about the same. And you will notice that OSHA uses the 90 dBA with a 5 dB doubling. The Air Force and Navy use 84 dB with a 4 dB doubling. Army uses 85 but a 4 dB doubling. ISO uses 85 but a 3 dB doubling. And so you say to me, which is the truth? And I say to you, I don't know. There is data that would support almost any one of these standards. There's data that would support almost everything that we're using. It seems to me that the data is more convincing. The data that's reported used by ISO, and that's also the same thing as the NIOSH standard pretty much. That seems to be more convincing. You will probably understand we can't do a study on this. I will never get it through human subjects if I try to have a prospective study in which I expose workers to X dB of noise for X dB for that many years. That's not going to happen. Nobody will allow me to do that study. And here are some examples of the kind of differences between those standards. There are also some other OSHA levels that we have to worry about. OSHA has said that you should not exceed a level of 115 for any duration of noise. We know that some musicians, if you put a microphone down the ear canal and they're playing their instrument, those noise levels come close to 115, okay? And if you've got the horn playing right in front of you, that can also exceed that. 140 is the maximum recommended exposure to an impulse sound. That would, a drum beat could be sort of as an impulsive sound. Now, the government also has another thing in the OSHA regulations and also in recommendations from NIOSH and the other organizations, which is that at 85 dB, a hearing conservation program needs to be initiated. And a hearing conservation program could be initiated by us as well. And all it says is that you've got to have something that will tell the worker what kind of what noise is, what hearing is, and why it's a concern. You've got to measure the worker's hearing periodically to see what his hearing was before he started on the job and after each year to see if there's been any change. There are regulations on how this program should be implemented, et cetera. And that's a perfectly doable thing and one which is required under the OSHA regulations and is recommended under just about everybody else's recommendation. This shows the length of time that you can be exposed to sounds by octave. Because although we've been talking about dBA, dBA is a number that combines as an average of several frequencies together. It's actually around a 40 dB fine line. We won't go into that. But this is the time, duration in minutes that you could be exposed to noise at different frequency ranges without being expected to have a hearing loss. And you can see that it varies by frequency, and I don't think I can, is it this button thing?
There's a laser pointer next to it.
Oh, the laser pointer will, no, no.
The black one.
The black one, the little one. Okay. Yeah. So if you take one of these lines, 60 minutes, for example, okay, you can see that you can be exposed to a lot more low-frequency sound than you can mid-frequency sound or high-frequency sound, theoretically without damage. this is another way of predicting, saying how much, and I don't want to go into the whole formula, but essentially it says, if I want to see how much hearing loss you're going to have after after 10 years, 20 years, I want to say that you shouldn't have more than 5 dB of hearing loss. This is how I can predict how much loss you will have. You can do it by frequency and by level. It's pretty cute. It works, kind of, sort of. Okay. Here then again is a restatement of the allowable time for various noise levels from OSHA and from NIOSH. And you can see that at a level of 85, theoretically OSHA says you could work for 16 hours. NIOSH says you can work for 8. I want to go to work for NIOSH if I get paid the same rate. At 95, 4 hours for OSHA, 48 minutes under the NIOSH. And that's also about the same as the International Standards Organization recommendations. At 105, an hour for OSHA, 9.5 minutes for NIOSH. And if you look at these levels and you think about them in terms of musical instruments, you can see that you would be restricted in your practice to a very short length of time if you were playing a loud instrument or playing an instrument loudly. I recall that one of my colleagues measured the first violinist in the Chicago Symphony, and when they measured the noise levels, they were quite high. They were over, I believe, 110. Wasn't that about what we got? In the ear canal? Was it what? 105. In the ear canal, when he was playing the violin for an average, for a time-weighted average over the day, not for just a few minutes. And when he talked to the guy, he said, well, this is terrible. How come you've got this? Why? And he said, well, I practice the loud passages a lot more than I do the soft passages, because the loud passages are harder to control than the soft passages. Therefore, even though overall the musical piece that I might be playing might be closer to 80 dBA, the part that I'm practicing is going to be up closer to 105 because I've got to be sure that I get those right. And not coincidentally, the gentleman has a hearing loss, substantial hearing loss. Noise exposure, we expect that if you're exposed to 90 dBA, that after 40 years of experience of exposure, about 29% of the people will have hearing loss. At 85, about 15%, and at 83%. Some people think those numbers are a little bit low, that the percentages might be even higher. So in closing, I tell you, honk if you hate noise. Thank you. Any questions? Any questions? We're continuing with our complete answering of every thought? No? Oh, we got one. Good.
Carol Duffy, OT again. Are there chemical, like medication or drug or indication, things that can cause hearing loss?
Yes. Yes, there are a number of medicines that can cause hearing loss, and there are also some studies that show some medicines in combination with noise makes it worse. We know that many of the antibiotics can cause hearing loss. They don't always. Sometimes they cause vestibular problems. Sometimes they cause hearing loss. A prudent physician will always do a protocol in which they will test your hearing before you begin the aminoglycoside treatment, and then we'll test you afterwards. Aspirin is the one medication that you can take and hearing loss will be reversible. You will have a hearing loss when you're taking aspirin. If you take massive doses of aspirin for arthritis, for example, and then you stop taking it, you will have a hearing loss, you will have tinnitus, but usually the hearing comes back. But with the aminoglycosides, you almost always will a percentage of people will have hearing loss when exposed to that. And there are studies that indicate that some people, when exposed to noise plus medications, will have even more hearing loss. Happens that they're in the same frequency range. They both cause high frequency losses, but the ototoxic medications rarely give us the notch. that we see in noise-induced hearing loss, which is one of the differences that we can spot. Yeah.
Any thought on the new studies coming out through the Department of Defense, Department of Navy about medications for protection of hearing in case of noise exposure?
Yeah, some of those look quite promising. There is a medication that's out now that supposedly, if taken within a short time of this noise exposure, and possibly if taken before noise exposure, will prevent noise-induced hearing loss. It's still, as I understand, experimental. They haven't finished the studies, but some of them look quite promising. So if we could use this either in industry, now the other part of that is that it's new enough that we don't know what other side effects occur. We don't know whether there are other possible, this is a wonderful thing with medicine. All of you who deal with medicine know that you find a medicine that really is great. An example is one of the aminoglycosides, dihydrostreptomycin, which got rid of TB like that when tuberculosis was a major problem. But it also caused very profound hearing loss almost immediately and was irreversible. Okay, so now we don't give dihydrostreptomycin anymore. We give streptomycin, which doesn't cause as much of a problem. So almost always when you give a medication, it helps something, but it may hurt something else. And I don't think we know about these meds yet, but they certainly do seem to show real promise in terms of preventing hearing loss. Yeah.
Is this mic on? Yeah. I'd just like to add something there. I agree that they show some promise. The studies are just now being conducted in humans, so they're animal studies. The key is that they are not anticipated that they would replace hearing protection. We're not talking about the amount of protection that would obviate the need to use a protector. We're talking about something that would be in addition. And the reason the military is so interested is because substantial numbers of people in the military who get hearing loss are wearing hearing protection, but they are unexpected exposures. For example, the person next to you fired their rifle. You weren't wearing your earplugs at the time. You had no idea that was going to happen. Or there's an explosion that occurs, a bomb goes off. You were unaware that that was going to happen. So if you could take these in advance to have some additional protection from unexpected exposures and use your hearing protection, that's a great combination. But it's not something that I would ever expect that the musicians before a performance would take their NAC or whatever instead of wearing a hearing protection device.
Right.
Could you comment on the noise exposure from fire alarms in public buildings? There's one right at the door I have to exit when the fire alarm goes off, and it's painful.
There actually is an international standard on warning devices that seems to be ignored in this country, partly because of the way they measure sound for fire alarms. We worked with the fire department in my community because I happen to know about that standard and they didn't. There is a fire warning device standard for how loud the things are supposed to be. But it's a trade-off, because if you don't make it loud enough, then people won't hear. In fact, there's some question about what do you do in a senior citizen community where a home where many of the people have hearing losses. Do you need to make these louder? What's the issue? And so those standards are unclear, although there is an international standard for audible signals for danger. But as I said, the fire people don't seem to be aware of it, and I agree. The one that got me is when our fire marshal initially wanted us to have one in the sound booth, which we've got people that are in there, we're checking their hearing aid, and we put off a fire alarm. Right. Guess what's going to happen to their hearing? Yeah. At least we know why they had a hearing loss.
Could you comment on disclosure, if that's included in any of the standards? And the question comes from learning that the military band personnel are given information disclosing the sound levels that they're exposed to, and in fact have to sign a consent form acknowledging that they're aware of the risks. And are there any precedent for that in the school systems?
Yeah, in the hearing conservation program, that's part of it. You have to tell the workers that they are being exposed to certain levels of noise on the workplace. Now, I don't know if they have to sign a disclosure, that they have to sign a statement saying that they've been told that. But that's supposed to be in the educational program, that they're told that they are being exposed to levels that are potentially dangerous, and that they need to be aware of that. Now, you know as well as I do, I recall I talked one day to an engineer, railroad engineer, who told me that he was told that, but all the guys that he drove the train with said, "You're a sissy if you wear those ear protectors, and we'll tell the union that you're a real sissy if you do." So he didn't. But he was told that there was a problem and that he should wear them. He, of course, has a hearing loss.
And are you saying that there's no oversight for people in the colleges or the public schools
Not to my knowledge.
provide that
not to-
disclosure if in fact it's known that the levels exceed OSHA?
Not to my knowledge, because those are not covered by OSHA or any federal regulations. If there was an agency, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that did have standards, then that would have to be disclosed. But at the present time, to my knowledge, there's nothing that says in the schools that you have to tell people if you're going to expose them to certain levels. Some people do, but most people don't have to. Don't. Yes.
Yes, Bill Dawson, Northwestern University. Also, there's a corollary to the information that the military have to do. The military bands people, all military musicians, are required to take annual audiograms. And hearing loss in the military is line of duty, yes.
That's correct.
But all have to have annual audiograms.
Right. Any military person has to have annual audiograms. But that started after the Second World War. It's been relatively recent. I've gone back and looked at some of those records, and they're ridiculous, and trying to figure out what kind of hearing level the person had. In fact, I was telling these people before, I had a physical at the Pentagon, and I thought I would have the best possible physical, you know, I mean, really. And the hearing test was, "Can you hear me?" And so I'm quite sure that some of those Army personnel had that same test.
Kimberly Dayacha, University of Miami. Can you tell us the differences in the causes of tinnitus and regular hearing loss?
No, because in some cases it's the same, in some cases it is not. There are different types of tinnitus. If we knew exactly what caused each tinnitus, we know that some medications cause tinnitus in some people. Noise causes tinnitus in most people. An explosive noise almost always causes tinnitus, but noise over a long period of time doesn't necessarily, and it varies. There are other kinds of pathology that can cause tinnitus. There are dozens of causes of tinnitus, just as there are dozens of causes of noise-induced hearing loss, although with noise-induced hearing loss, if we get to a certain level, we almost always can predict. They go along together, but not everybody who has a hearing loss has noise-induced hearing loss, has a tinnitus, and vice versa. I've been asked to testify a couple of times for people who have noise-induced hearing loss, and people have tried to have lawsuits on tinnitus that they say was caused by noise. I have absolutely refused to be an expert witness in those cases because I can't prove it. I can't prove whether they have tinnitus or don't have tinnitus or how much tinnitus they have. We don't have good standards for doing that. Therefore, I can't possibly say whether they did or didn't have tinnitus because of the exposure to noise. Any other questions? But I think we kind of need to move along, although we're doing pretty well. Any other questions? We'll get to some others later.
Back.
Okay. Great. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Pete Townsend of The Who. No, I'm lying. Pete Townsend actually did more for this field than all of us combined. Since 1985, when I started to work with musicians, I've been telling them about the need for hearing protection and some of the things I'm going to be talking about today, but you know, they did this to me, which is metric for you know what. But it was Pete Townsend of The Who that got up there and said, guys, listen, it's 1985, it's cool to wear hearing protection now. It's something that you're not going to be a sissy to do. And it's people like him that actually came out of the woodwork and said it's great, and people followed in his footsteps. And when I tried to get someone in 1985 to wear an ear protector, they would say, no, thank you. 1995, almost 90% of those that came into our clinic, many of who came in for musculoskeletal problems, not hearing problems, they decided to get ear protection. And today, virtually everyone decides to get hearing protection, not because of me or any of the other people on this committee, but by the rich and famous, or the people that have long hair and know how to play the guitar quite well. I've been asked today to talk about strategies to minimize the potential for music-induced hearing loss. Certainly, the number one strategy is what Elliot Berger will be talking about next, which is hearing protection. And it's important to point out that there are tons of different types of hearing protection. In some work I've done with the Toronto Symphony, we're dealing with 5 different forms of hearing protection. The ear protection for a violinist is not the hearing protection for a bassoonist, and is not the hearing protection for a bass player or a drummer. It's quite different, but Elliot will be talking about some of these things shortly. Oops. We had a little bit of trouble in Toronto last year with SARS, and so this was an attempt to get people to visit Toronto, and so it's come for SARS, stay for the West Nile virus. I don't know how well it worked. We have that this year as well, though, at least the West Nile. The big 4. These are quick and dirty, cheap and easy, expedient and expeditious techniques to minimize hearing loss using strategies. Moderation, humming, improved monitoring, and environmental changes. And I'd like to go through each one of these separately. Moderation. We've learned from our 2 previous speakers that the 2 major factors affecting hearing loss are the intensity, and we usually measure that in decibels A-weighted. A-weighted simply means the way the human ear responds to sound. As it turns out, most of the low bass notes never get through to our auditory system. They come down the ear canal, they bounce off the eardrum, and they go back out again. And so A-weighted acknowledges that and tries to get an assessment of what actually gets through. And the other thing, other than the peak intensity, or the dBA intensity rather, is how long you're exposed. And it's no secret that rock and rollers are less susceptible to music exposure, hearing loss, than rock and rollers. Than classical people. Classical people, as I said in the introduction, they have to work 40 hours, 50 hours a week sometimes between their practicing, teaching, and performing, whereas a rock and roller may pick up his guitar on a Friday night and never touch it again for 2 or 3 weeks. So although the peak or the instantaneous dBA that he gets on that Friday night is quite high, the duration is very minimal for these people. Taking the 3 dB exchange rate that Dr. Wilbur talked about, I think that's probably a reasonable thing to do. And what that means is that we can be exposed, as she said, 85 decibels A-weighted for 40 hours a week. That's the very same thing as 88 decibels for 20 hours a week, 91 for 10 hours a week, 5 hours a week for 94, and so on. Now, it's amazing how insensitive we humans are to intensity. We're very sensitive to pitch. A slight pitch change we can discern, whether we have a hearing loss or not, actually. However, for intensity, I can say 2 sounds. I'm through a PA system, so it might not work very well, but I'll disconnect myself just for a moment. I'm going to give you 2 sounds that are 3 decibels apart, the second one being a little bit louder, 3 decibels louder. What that means, though, in terms of exposure, is that if I can reduce something by a measly 3 decibels, I can be exposed twice as long before the same damage occurs. So instead of me working 8 hours, I can work 16 hours in a certain environment if I just reduce it by a barely detectable 3 decibels. So I'll use the vowel ah, ah. Second one was 3 decibels louder. You knew it was louder because I told it to you, but if I didn't tell you, I think you'd be hard-pressed to discern that the second one was that much louder. So 3 decibels is barely detectable, yet it's double the energy, double the damage. Conversely, if we can reduce something by 3 decibels, it's barely detectable, but we've halved the exposure. Moderation is a big issue. So there's nothing wrong with going to a rock concert on Friday night. Just don't mow your lawn the next day. Or better still, get someone else to mow it for you. Now, a lot of musicians and people around music have to be exposed from time to time to louder music, and that's okay. Go ahead and enjoy the rock concert. Sit front row center if you want. You'll really enjoy it. Just cool it for a day or 2 and give your ears a little bit of a rest. So moderation is a simple, easy thing to do. It's a very natural thing to do. Hum. That's a big one. Well, when Mother Nature built us, she included a really neat little mechanism in our middle ear. Now, our middle ear is just behind the eardrum, and that has nothing to do with the part of the ear that's being damaged. But as Dr. Tufts initially pointed out, behind the eardrum, there's the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, or the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, the three little bones. Connected to the third little bone is a little muscle called the stapes muscle, or the stapedial muscle. And there's a small reflex, and a reflex is something that happens naturally in a system. So if I put my hand on a hot stove, I'm not going to have to wait around and think about something. Oh, it's hot, I better take my hand off the stove, and then a second or two remove it. No, a reflex is just that you get an impulse, it goes up, not quite up to the brain, but then turns around, comes back down to your muscle, says it's hot, and your hand just reflex pulls it away very quickly. It's a natural defensive mechanism. Well, it turns out our ear also has a natural defensive mechanism. Upon loud sounds, specifically that of our own voice, that muscle in the ear tightens up. And when it tightens up, it pulls on these three little bones that we saw in the middle ear, making them a poorer, a less efficient mechanism to transmit sound. So when this muscle is tightened up, the sound doesn't get through the eardrum very effectively, doesn't get through to the cochlea, where the damage could potentially occur as effectively. And this is the stapedius reflex, and I think we have it from an evolutionary point of view, so our own voice doesn't sound too loud to ourselves. This is a picture. Just if you look at the miniaturized version in the top right-hand corner, connected to the thing that looks like a horse's stirrup or a stapes is a little tendon connected to a muscle here, and this is what pulls on the bones here. Incidentally, although I haven't seen Beethoven in the last couple of months, he probably had a bony growth around the stapes foot plate here, just at the very end here, that prevented it from vibrating very effectively. That's one of the theories about why Beethoven lost his hearing. We don't think Beethoven lost it from music exposure, although it'd be nice if he did. We can use him as a good example, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that. Two interesting studies in the literature about the stapedius reflex. The first one was, excuse me, pardon me, Zachrikson, his colleagues in 1980, and they studied Bell's palsy. Now, Bell's palsy is a one-sided, unilateral facial weakness in the nerve. And it's thankfully usually temporary. And the interesting thing about Bell's palsy is that while you have it, your hearing is fine. There's no effect on your hearing, but the stapedius reflex, that little muscle in the ear, is temporarily disconnected. So your hearing is wonderful, but while you have the facial weakness, that muscle is connected. And indeed, there is evidence out there to suggest that if you have any friends or musicians that do have Bell's palsy, they should be withdrawn from that noisy environment, whether it's musical or otherwise, until the Bell's palsy resolves. And what Zachrikson did with these patients is that he gave them a blast of loud noise and created what's called a TTS, or temporary threshold shift. Now, we've all experienced temporary threshold shifts when we go to a rock concert. When we come out, our ears are a little bit ringing, they feel a little bit full or numb. People might be mumbling a little bit more. And indeed, if I was sitting there with my audiometer at the exit to the stadium as a nerd and slapping the earphones on you, you would have a temporary hearing loss. And after 16 to 18 hours, that hearing loss would resolve or back up to a normal level. Enough of that, of course, and it becomes permanent. But this is the study he did with humans where he gave them a temporary problem. And he found that the TTS, or temporary hearing loss, was 10 decibels greater in the affected side, indicating that the not functioning stapedius reflexes made that side more prone or more susceptible to noise or music exposure. Then in the same lab, his colleague, Eric Borg, a couple years later, took bunny rabbits. And he surgically cut the stapedius tendon and muscle on one side, but left the other side intact. And then he gave these rabbits some very, very loud noises and created a permanent hearing loss, or a PTS, permanent threshold shift. And indeed, there was a 30 dB greater hearing loss on the operated side. Again, attesting to the fact that the stapedius reflex in the bunny rabbit was protective. That's the picture. Now, I'm not sure what that brown stuff is at the bottom right, posterior by his ass, but I'm sure actually, that's my rabbit. Yeah. My son calls him Keith. I don't know where that came from. Now, we're not rabbits. We're mammals, but you can't always extrapolate some animals to humans, but we are at least mammal. And also, TTS is not necessarily a predictor of permanent hearing loss. That is, a person that goes to a rock concert and seems to get a lot more temporary hearing loss after the concert than the next person, that first person is not necessarily more susceptible to hearing loss. It'd be neat if there was something black and white like that, that we could say that, yes, that person is overly susceptible to music exposure or noise exposure, but unfortunately it doesn't work out like that. So TTS is not really a great predictor of permanent hearing loss, and we're not rabbits, but even if we can reduce the sound level by a measly 3 decibels, if that stapedius reflex in we humans has some minimal effect, we can still be exposed for twice as long as if that's not the case. Now, the unfortunate or a characteristic of the stapedial reflex is that it only lasts about 10 or 12 seconds. And we do this clinical test routinely as an audiologist. Someone comes in, I would measure the middle ear function, and one of the tests I would do would be to give them a small sound or a louder sound in one ear, keep the sound on for a while, and see how long it takes for it to kind of die away. And if it dies away too quickly, that's bad news. That's an indication that there's something wrong with one of the nerves, and they have to see an ear doctor. However, even normal hearing people have some turning off, slowly gradual disconnecting of the stapedius reflex. And that's why in the industrial domain, in a factory where it's a steady state type of noise, an industrial worker may only get benefit from this reflex for the first 10 or 20 seconds, then after that, no more. Music, however, is quite different than factory noise. Music is loud, soft, loud, soft. The dynamics of music are different than the dynamics of noise exposure. And when it gets soft, it allows the stapedius reflex to reset itself, and then when the next loud component comes, it can be protective once again. Again, exactly how much that has the effect, we're not quite sure. We don't have all the data on that, other than to say that it's something, but we're not too sure what it is. So until we do know more data, it's prudent to whistle while you work, to hum. Because humming causes that stapedius reflex to be elicited. And you don't have to hum very loud, just like something very quiet. And musicians do this regularly. If you've ever done an experiment where you've hooked up microphones, maybe for other reasons, to measure sound levels or whatever, in an orchestra or any group, you'll find that a lot of the musicians, especially the drummers, grunt and whistle while they work. Like they're hitting their they're grunting away there. So there's a lot of phonating that goes on. Reeded woodwinds tend to elicit the stapedius reflex simply because of the vibration of the reed and through bone conduction cause the reflex to squinch up. You get that a lot with trumpet players and other brass players as well. During a cymbal crash, it's a good idea to elicit the reflex before the loud sound, so that if you know that there's going to be a cymbal crash or a rim shot, you can do something like this, and carry the hum through the whole thing. And many musicians, percussionists, do this quite naturally anyways. So this is a very simple, naturally occurring reflex by which we can effectively reduce the level that gets through to our inner ear by a little bit. But even that little bit, even though it may not be detectable, can mean that we can be exposed significantly longer to the same noise or music. Improved monitoring is the third big issue. Better awareness of the music means that one does not need to overplay. So often in an orchestra or a rock band, the 5 what? 5 minutes. For what? Oh, we have a break. Okay. Well, it looks like we have a break in 5 minutes, so I'll stop after this section, and then I'll continue briefly after the break. So that in many rock bands, the bass player is playing a certain intensity. Why? Because the drummer is right next to him, and he's fighting with the drummer. So the bass player is playing loud, so the guitarist is playing a little bit loud. The singer has to sing a little bit loud, and they all work off each other. They're all fighting each other. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. There's a wonderful device I use it quite a bit for amplified bass instruments, such as the bass or the drummer, let's say. These are called bass shakers. I use them a lot. They're small, tiny, miniature loudspeakers. They're the size of hockey pucks. I know you're American, but we have a game in Canada called hockey. They're about this big. And they're very low-frequency speakers, and they provide an improved awareness for the sound of the bass players and drummers. Rock and roll, for example, has to be loud. It's true. It has to be loud, but it doesn't have to be intense. In other words, we can delude many rock and roll players into thinking the music is really, really loud at a lower less damaging intensity level by maybe giving them some more bass, by giving them a more vibral, tactile feel to the music. What happens, though, when you give them this improved monitoring of their own instruments is that the overall playing sound levels are reduced. This is a picture. You can either bolt it to your seat of your drum seat, or you can bolt it to the floor, a 3/4 inch piece of plywood, just place it on the floor around where the bass player might stand or sit. And you'd have two little lines just going to the rack so that you get a normal music flow of it, but the bass player can certainly hear his or her music much better. The drummer can certainly hear their music a lot better. They don't play quite as loud because they're not fighting against the next person. They think they're playing louder than they really are, so nobody has to fight up on stage. The whole level tends to become a little bit lower, and also the wrist and arm problems walking into the doctor's clinics are fewer and further between. Let's just quickly go through a case example, then we'll take a quick break. This is a 25-year-old drummer that walked into my office. He actually went and saw my partner, Dr. John Chong, who specializes in musculoskeletal problems. And he had ruined his wrist playing drums. He read in a magazine that he needed to start wearing earplugs, so he started to wear his father's industrial strength earplugs. He came in complaining of wrist and arm problems. And it turned out that when we measured him playing on a practice pad with his industrial strength earplugs, he was practicing at about 110, 112 decibels. But without any earplugs, he only practiced at about 103, 104 decibels. In other words, the earplugs were taking off so much of the rim shot and the hi-hat that he started overplaying to compensate. And there was an 11 decibel difference there. And the important thing is that when we fit him with the right type of hearing protection, specifically the ER25, his arm and wrist problems went away because his playing level returned to a much more natural level. And his bandmate thanked us as well. No longer did they have this crazy drummer at the back of the audience there, or the stage. I'll just finish this section on improved monitoring then. In-ear monitors are another trick to improve monitoring. And they're miniature loudspeakers that look like hearing aids. They fit in the ear, they look like hearing aids, they smell like hearing aids, they taste like hearing, I don't know if they taste like hearing aids, but they're very tiny hearing aids, and they replace the large wedge monitor speakers that are in front, or those big giant speakers that are side wash off to the side to give you an improved monitoring of what's going up on stage. This is what they might look like. The one on the top right is from a company called Future Sonics, and it's a custom-made mold. It looks like a hearing aid, but instead of having a microphone, it has a cable that's connected through a Y cord back behind, and it's plugged into the rack, or if they move around a lot, they can plug it into an FM wireless system so they can move around on stage. And the FM wireless system is connected to the rack over here. So they can get the music they want. They can say, I want more bass. Well, that's done at the rack. I want a little bit less vocals. I want a little bit more of the drums. And they can get whatever mixture they want. When this is done, the overall playing level at the eardrum is much lower than it would have been had they had the monitor or the side wedge where they had to fight against the next person to hear it. The one on the bottom right is by Sensophonics, another manufacturer. There are many manufacturers of these devices. The one on your left is called the ER6 from Etymonic Research. That's a non-custom one. But even the non-custom one with these little flange earplugs at the end can be customized to make earplugs that will fit your ear perfectly. So there are many different forms of these ear monitors. So improved monitoring. In-ear monitors allow the musician to mix and select the music they want without having to fight with one another. And the bottom line is lower sound level with less potential for hearing damage. At this point, we're getting to the last section, which is the environmental changes. And when we get back from the break, we'll talk about 4 very simple environmental changes that don't cost much money and can be done even at the high school level. Very simple sorts of things. So we'll stop at this point, maybe meet back in 10 minutes. Is that reasonable? It's 3:30 now. Maybe meet back at 20 to 4. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Chris? Okay, thanks.